December 23, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German Panzergrenadier Heinrich Krüger crouches behind a snow-covered fallen tree, watching his entire company advance across an open field toward American positions near Bastogne. For 8 days, Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's desperate winter offensive, has been pushing the Americans back. Krüger feels confident. The Americans seem caught off guard, retreating in panic. Then the sky explodes. But not the way artillery normally explodes. These shells aren't hitting the ground and throwing up geysers of dirt and snow. They're detonating 20 feet above his comrades' heads, spraying deadly steel fragments downward like an invisible hand opening umbrellas of death across the entire field. In 30 seconds, Krüger watches 127 men in his company get shredded by what seems like impossible, supernatural firepower. Men who should have been safe in depressions, behind small rises, even lying flat, cut down by metal fragments raining from above. Krüger will later tell interrogators, "It was like fighting ghosts who could see through the earth itself." What Heinrich Krüger witnessed was the combat debut of America's most closely guarded secret weapon, the proximity fuse. A device so revolutionary that it would turn Hitler's last great offensive from a potential German victory into a mechanical slaughter that changed the course of World War II forever. The Germans had no idea what hit them. And by the time they figured it out, entire panzer divisions had been reduced to scattered survivors stumbling through the Belgian snow, asking the same terrified question: how do you fight artillery shells that think? Stories like this take months of research through classified documents and veteran interviews. If you want to support more untold World War II revelations, subscribing means everything to independent historians like us. To understand the massacre that proximity fuses unleashed during the Battle of the Bulge, you need to understand just how revolutionary and secret this technology was. In 1940, while German Stukas were dive-bombing London and U-boats were strangling Allied shipping, American scientists at Johns Hopkins University were working on what would become the most closely guarded technological secret of World War II. More secret than the Manhattan Project. More restricted than radar development. The proximity fuse, officially called the VT fuse to hide its true nature, was essentially a tiny radar system built into an artillery shell. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, these shells would detect when they were close to a target and detonate at the optimal height to maximize casualties. Traditional artillery had a fatal flaw: most shells buried themselves in dirt before exploding, sending their deadly fragments into the earth rather than into enemy soldiers. Gunners could set time fuses, trying to guess exactly when a shell should explode in mid-air, but this required perfect calculations of wind, temperature, target distance, and shell velocity. Get it wrong by half a second, and your shells exploded harmlessly in the sky or buried themselves uselessly in the ground. The proximity fuse solved this problem with terrifying efficiency. Each shell contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. As the shell approached the ground, or more importantly, approached human targets, radio waves would bounce back to the shell's receiver. When the return signal reached a certain strength, indicating optimal proximity to targets, the shell would detonate automatically. The result was devastating. Proximity fuses increased artillery effectiveness by 600% against personnel targets. Areas that would normally provide cover, shallow depressions, the reverse slopes of hills, even foxholes, became death traps as explosive fragments rained down from directly overhead. By December 1944, American factories were producing 100,000 proximity fuses per day. But the technology remained so secret that even most American artillery officers didn't understand how their new ammunition worked. They were simply told that the new VT shells were more effective and should be used whenever possible. The secrecy was necessary. If proximity fuses fell into German hands and were reverse-engineered, the technology could be turned against Allied forces. Even worse, the same radio principles could be adapted for use in German V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, potentially making Hitler's terror weapons far more deadly against civilian targets. So when the first proximity fuse shells were shipped to European battlefields in late 1944, they came with strict orders: use them only in offensive operations where there was no chance of unexploded shells falling into enemy hands. For months, proximity fuses had been used successfully in the Pacific Theater against Japanese aircraft and naval targets, where any unexploded shells would sink harmlessly into the ocean. But ground combat in Europe was different. Too risky. Too much chance of the secret being compromised. Then Adolf Hitler made the decision that would introduce German forces to America's secret weapon in the most brutal way possible. By December 1944, Germany was dying. The Third Reich was being crushed between Soviet forces advancing from the east and British-American forces advancing from the west. German fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow force. Nazi-occupied territory was shrinking daily. Hitler's response was characteristically desperate and grandiose: one massive surprise offensive that would split the Western Allies, recapture the crucial port of Antwerp, and potentially force a separate peace with Britain and America. This would free German forces to concentrate entirely against Stalin's advancing Red Army. The plan was codenamed Watch on the Rhine. Americans would later call it the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler scraped together his last strategic reserves: 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and 1,600 artillery pieces. The offensive would punch through the Ardennes forest, exactly where German forces had achieved their stunning breakthrough in 1940. The same terrain that had allowed Germany to conquer France in 6 weeks would now be used to reverse the course of World War II. German commanders were skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt called the plan a desperate gamble. But Hitler insisted this was Germany's last chance. The offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, with the largest artillery barrage German forces had fired since 1940. Across an 85-mile front, German shells screamed into American positions. Then came the tanks and infantry, advancing through pre-dawn darkness and heavy fog that grounded Allied aircraft. Initially, the plan worked. American forces were indeed caught off guard. Entire units retreated in confusion. By December 19, German spearheads had advanced 50 miles into American-held territory, creating a massive bulge in Allied lines. But Hitler's offensive had an unintended consequence: it finally gave American commanders the justification they needed to use their most secret weapon. German forces were advancing in the open, far from their own supply lines, with little chance of unexploded American shells being recovered and analyzed. If you've watched this far, you clearly love military history. Please subscribe, or content like this disappears into the algorithm's black hole. The authorization came down from the highest levels. Proximity fuses were cleared for use against German ground forces. What happened next would turn Hitler's last gamble into a technological massacre. The first proximity fuse shells fired in ground combat arrived at American artillery positions near Bastogne on December 22, 1944. They came in unmarked wooden crates with handling instructions that seemed almost mystical to the gun crews receiving them. Fuse will function automatically. Do not attempt to adjust or tamper with mechanism. Effectiveness optimized at 20 to 30 feet above target. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding a battery of 105 mm howitzers with the 101st Airborne Division, later recalled, "We'd been firing regular high explosive and white phosphorus for 6 days straight. Then these mysterious new shells show up with instructions that made no damn sense. Automatic function? How's a shell supposed to know when to explode?" Hayes wouldn't have to wonder long. At 2:15 p.m. that same day, German reconnaissance reported a massive formation of American armor and infantry concentrating near the village of Champs, just north of Bastogne. It was actually a false report. Nervous German observers had mistaken abandoned American vehicles and equipment for active forces. But German artillery commander Colonel Friedrich Weber ordered an immediate counter-battery mission. Weber's guns opened fire first, sending traditional high-explosive shells screaming toward the suspected American positions. The shells impacted and exploded normally, throwing up clouds of snow and frozen earth but hitting mostly empty ground and abandoned equipment. Then Captain Hayes received orders to return fire on the German artillery positions. Hayes loaded his guns with proximity fuse shells and targeted the coordinates his forward observers had identified, an open field where German artillery pieces had been spotted. He had no idea he was about to make military history. "I gave the command to fire for effect," Hayes later wrote in his after-action report. 12 rounds, proximity fuse, target concentration of enemy artillery in the open. What happened next was unlike anything anyone on that battlefield had ever witnessed. The 12 shells arced through the cold December air and began their descent toward German positions. But instead of impacting the ground, each shell's proximity fuse activated at exactly 23 feet above the target area. 12 perfect airburst explosions detonated simultaneously over Colonel Weber's artillery battery. The effect was devastating beyond anything traditional artillery could achieve. Steel fragments, propelled downward at lethal velocity, swept across the entire target area. German gunners who would have survived by throwing themselves flat, who would have been protected by their guns and ammunition caissons, who might have taken shelter in small depressions or behind equipment, all were caught in a deadly rain of metal fragments. Weber's battery was destroyed in 30 seconds. Not just disabled, completely annihilated. Of the 48 men operating 4 artillery pieces, 43 were killed instantly and 5 were wounded so severely they died within hours. But the real shock came from German survivors in nearby positions who witnessed the attack. Lieutenant Hans Richter, positioned 300 yards away with a machine gun team, watched the entire strike. The shells came down and exploded in the air, like umbrellas of fire opening above our comrades. "I had never seen anything like it. Artillery shells that knew exactly when to explode. It was impossible, but we watched it happen." More importantly, Richter immediately grasped the tactical implications. In his report to regimental headquarters, he wrote, "American artillery can now detonate shells at optimal height without time fuses. No position offers protection except deep bunkers. Recommend immediate tactical adjustment for all offensive operations." But Richter's warning never reached higher command levels. The German communication network around Bastogne was already breaking down under constant American counterattacks, and isolated reports of unusual enemy capabilities were dismissed as battlefield hysteria. German commanders were focused on maintaining offensive momentum, not analyzing new American weapons. The larger tactical situation seemed to favor continued German advances. American forces appeared to be retreating on multiple fronts, weather conditions prevented Allied air support, and German tank spearheads were still pushing westward toward their objectives. What German commanders didn't realize was that proximity fuse ammunition was already being distributed to every American artillery unit in the Ardennes sector. By December 23, American gun positions held over 50,000 proximity fuse shells, with more arriving hourly. The stage was set for a technological massacre. At German Army Group B headquarters, Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed the latest situation reports with cautious optimism. His forces had advanced further than anyone expected. American resistance seemed disorganized. Fuel supplies, while limited, were holding up better than predicted. Model's intelligence officers reported scattered instances of unusually effective American artillery fire, but these reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Some mentioned shells exploding in the air, others described impossibly accurate targeting of German positions in defilade. None of the reports suggested a systematic new American capability. "The Americans are fighting desperately," Model told his staff on the evening of December 23. "Their artillery fire has increased in intensity, but this is to be expected as they concentrate their remaining reserves. We must maintain pressure and continue the advance." Model issued orders for renewed attacks across the entire front beginning at dawn on December 24. German infantry and armor would advance in coordinated formations, supported by all available artillery and the few remaining Luftwaffe aircraft that could reach the battlefield. It would be the largest coordinated German ground assault since the opening hours of the offensive 8 days earlier. It would also provide American artillery units with perfect targets for their proximity fuse shells, massed German formations advancing across open ground in daylight. Only a small % of viewers ever subscribe. Don't be part of the silent majority, help keep these forgotten military technologies alive by hitting that subscribe button. December 24, 1944, dawned clear and cold across the Ardennes. For the first time in over a week, heavy fog and low clouds lifted, revealing a winter landscape transformed into a battlefield of scattered vehicles, cratered snow, and the dark shapes of frozen corpses. German commanders saw the clear weather as both opportunity and threat. Opportunity because their advancing formations could finally coordinate effectively across multiple sectors. Threat because clear skies meant American aircraft would return to the battle. But German planning focused on the opportunity. Field Marshal Model's orders were explicit: exploit the clear weather to achieve maximum territorial gains before Allied air power could intervene. All available German forces would attack simultaneously at 0600 hours. What German commanders didn't anticipate was that clear weather also provided American artillery observers with perfect visibility of German formations, and American gunners with perfect targets for their proximity fuse shells. The massacre began at 6:23 a.m. near the village of Mannheim. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper's armored spearhead, the furthest German penetration into American territory, was advancing across a series of open fields toward American positions on high ground. Paper's force included 22 Panzer IV and Panther tanks supported by 2 battalions of Panzergrenadiers, roughly 800 men total. From American observation posts, the German formation looked like a military parade, vehicles and infantry advancing in coordinated lines across snow-covered terrain with no concealment available. Major Thomas Anderson, forward observer with the 7th Armored Division, called for immediate artillery support, fire mission. Concentration of enemy armor and infantry in the open. Range 4,200 meters. Request proximity fuse. 6 American artillery battalions responded simultaneously. 72 guns loaded with proximity fuse shells targeted Paper's advancing formation. From my position, I could see the German tanks and half-track spread across maybe 800 yards of open ground, Anderson later recalled. Beautiful targets. When those proximity shells started exploding above them, it looked like someone had strung Christmas lights across the entire field. Except each light was shrapnel raining down. The first salvo of 72 shells detonated in perfect airbursts 20 feet above Paper's formation. Steel fragments swept downward, shredding exposed German infantry and penetrating the thin top armor of German vehicles. Panzergrenadiers who threw themselves flat for protection discovered that proximity fuses made traditional evasive tactics useless. But the real devastation came from the sustained barrage that followed. American artillery doctrine called for fire for effect once targets were bracketed, continuous shelling until the target was destroyed or abandoned. With unlimited proximity fuse ammunition available, American gunners poured shells into the target area for 12 minutes. Over 400 proximity fuse shells exploded above Paper's formation during those 12 minutes. The effect was unlike anything seen in modern warfare. German vehicles that might have survived direct hits from traditional high-explosive shells were disabled by fragments penetrating their engine compartments and crew areas from above. Infantry formations were simply obliterated, there was nowhere to hide from fragments raining down from the sky. When the barrage lifted, Paper's entire spearhead had been reduced to burning vehicles and scattered survivors. Of 800 men who had begun the attack, fewer than 200 were capable of continued fighting. Most of Paper's tanks were destroyed or disabled. Lieutenant Colonel Paper, whose armored columns had terrorized American forces for 8 days, radioed his desperate situation to higher headquarters: massive enemy artillery with impossible accuracy. Request immediate withdrawal authorization. Unit combat effectiveness destroyed. But Paper's disaster was only beginning. Similar scenes were playing out across the entire German front. Clear weather had allowed German commanders to coordinate large-scale attacks, and had simultaneously provided American artillery with perfect targets for proximity fuse shells. Near Bastogne, the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division launched a coordinated assault against American positions with 1,200 men advancing across open ground. American gunners responded with proximity fuse barrage that lasted 8 minutes. German casualties exceeded 60%. At Mannheim, German forces attempting to exploit Paper's breakthrough found themselves caught in the open as proximity fuse shells turned their advance into a killing field. Near St. Vith, German artillery positions that had been effectively suppressing American forces for days were systematically destroyed by counter-battery fire using proximity fuse shells. The pattern was consistent: German forces advancing or massed in the open were being annihilated by artillery that seemed impossibly accurate and deadly. German field commanders began reporting the same phenomenon across multiple sectors: American artillery shells that exploded at precisely the right height to maximize casualties, with no apparent time delay or adjustment needed by American gunners. Major General Otto von Manschufel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, received increasingly desperate reports throughout December 24, enemy artillery demonstrating new capability. Shells detonating at optimal height without time fuse adjustment. Recommend avoiding open ground movement during daylight. Enemy fire control impossibly precise. Request immediate tactical guidance for countering new American artillery techniques. Manschufel, a veteran commander who had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet artillery, initially dismissed these reports as battlefield confusion. But by noon on December 24, the pattern was undeniable. "Something has changed with American artillery," Manschufel radioed to Army Group B headquarters. "Our casualties from indirect fire have increased dramatically. Formations that should be protected by terrain are being destroyed. Request intelligence assessment of new enemy capabilities." German intelligence had no answers. Captured American artillery shells showed no obvious modifications. Interrogated American prisoners claimed no knowledge of new weapons or tactics. German radio intercept teams detected no unusual American fire control procedures. The proximity fuse remained a complete mystery to German forces. But the tactical implications were becoming clear: traditional German infantry and armor tactics were suicidal against this new American capability. Open ground advances resulted in catastrophic casualties. Massed formations were death traps. Even indirect approaches through depressions and reverse slopes provided no protection. By evening on December 24, German offensive operations had effectively stalled. Not because of American ground resistance or air power, but because German forces could no longer mass for coordinated attacks without suffering unacceptable casualties from proximity fuse artillery. Field Marshal Model, reviewing casualty reports from the day's fighting, faced a tactical nightmare. German forces had suffered over 8,000 casualties on December 24 alone, more than during any previous day of the offensive. Most casualties were from artillery fire, and most occurred among formations that should have been relatively protected from traditional indirect fire. Model's operations officer, Colonel Heinrich Guderian, son of the famous Panzer General, summarized the situation in his evening briefing: "American artillery effectiveness has increased beyond all previous parameters. Our standard tactical procedures are resulting in disproportionate casualties. Recommend immediate defensive posture until this new American capability can be analyzed and countered." But Hitler's explicit orders prohibited any defensive action. The offensive must continue regardless of casualties. Think of how much effort went into uncovering these classified battle reports. Hitting subscribe takes just 1 second and keeps this research funded. German commanders faced an impossible choice: continue attacking and watch their remaining forces be systematically destroyed by proximity fuse artillery, or disobey Hitler's direct orders and assume a defensive posture. Most chose to continue attacking. It was a decision that would turn the Battle of the Bulge from a German offensive into a German catastrophe. December 26, 1944. The killing fields of Belgium. For 2 days, German forces had been advancing into what they now privately called the death zone, any open ground within range of American artillery. But Hitler's orders remained unchanged: continue the offensive at all costs. German commanders were trapped between tactical reality and strategic desperation. They knew their formations were being systematically destroyed by impossibly effective American artillery. But they also knew that stopping the offensive meant Germany would lose its last chance to avoid total defeat. The climactic moment came during Operation Grief, a desperate German attempt to capture the crucial Meuse River bridges that would allow German armor to exploit westward toward Antwerp. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite special operations commander, had been tasked with leading this phase of the offensive. Skorzeny's plan called for German soldiers disguised as Americans to infiltrate Allied lines and seize key bridges, followed immediately by massive German armored assaults to exploit the captured crossing points. By December 26, Skorzeny's infiltration teams had achieved limited success. Several small American units had been confused or misdirected by German soldiers wearing American uniforms and speaking perfect English. More importantly, German intelligence had identified the precise locations and defensive strength of American forces guarding the Meuse River crossings. The stage was set for the largest German armored assault since the offensive began, 3 full panzer divisions, supported by all available artillery and the last reserve battalions of elite German paratroopers. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the German XLVI Panzer Corps, received his attack orders at 0400 hours on December 26, advance across the Arve River Valley. Seize Meuse River bridges at Dinant and Givet. Exploit westward immediately upon securing crossing points. Speed is essential. Luttwitz studied the terrain between his current positions and the Meuse River. The advance would require his 3 panzer divisions to cross 12 miles of relatively open ground, with minimal concealment available. But intelligence reports suggested only light American resistance along the route. What German intelligence had not detected was the concentration of American artillery that had been building for 3 days specifically to counter this expected German thrust. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the American 18 Airborne Corps, had positioned 11 artillery battalions in carefully surveyed positions covering every possible German approach route to the Meuse River. Every gun was supplied with unlimited proximity fuse ammunition. Collins had also received ultra-intelligence, decrypted German communications revealing the exact timing and objectives of the German attack. American forces knew exactly where German armor would advance, when the attack would begin, and what routes German forces would use. "We have perfect intelligence, perfect weather, perfect fields of fire, and unlimited proximity fuse ammunition," Collins told his artillery commanders on the evening of December 25. "Tomorrow we end this German offensive permanently." The German attack began at 0630 hours on December 26. Luttwitz's 3 panzer divisions advanced in a coordinated formation across the Arve River Valley, the 2nd Panzer Division on the north, the 116th Panzer Division in the center, and the Panzer Lehr Division on the south. Nearly 300 German tanks and assault guns, supported by 15,000 infantry. From American observation posts on high ground overlooking the valley, the German formation presented an artillery officer's dream, massed enemy forces advancing in the open with no effective concealment available. At 0645 hours, every American artillery piece within range opened fire simultaneously. The first salvo of proximity fuse shells exploded above the German formation at exactly 0647 hours. What followed was the most concentrated artillery barrage of World War II, 11 battalions firing continuously for 43 minutes. Over 2,800 proximity fuse shells exploded above the German formation during those 43 minutes. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a German tank commander with the 2nd Panzer Division, survived the barrage and later described the experience during interrogation. "The shells exploded above us like a roof of fire. There was no escape, no place to hide. Men who jumped from disabled tanks were cut down by fragments falling from the sky. It was not battle, it was mechanical slaughter." The proximity fuses turned the Arve River Valley into a killing field unlike anything seen in modern warfare. German tanks that might have survived direct hits from traditional high-explosive shells were disabled by fragments penetrating their engine compartments, vision blocks, and crew hatches from above. Infantry formations were simply annihilated. But the most devastating effect was psychological. German soldiers who had survived 2 years of Eastern Front combat, who had endured Soviet artillery barrages and Katyusha rocket attacks, found themselves facing a weapon that seemed to violate the basic rules of warfare. Artillery shells that exploded at the perfect height to maximize casualties, with no adjustment or ranging required by enemy gunners. Colonel Wilhelm Denkert, commanding the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment, radioed his desperate situation to division headquarters at 0715 hours, regiment destroyed. Estimate 70% casualties. Enemy artillery impossible to counter. Request immediate withdrawal. Similar reports flooded German communication networks. 116th Panzer Division, combat effectiveness destroyed. Unable to continue attack. Panzer Lehr Division, massive casualties from enemy indirect fire. Recommend immediate defensive positions. XLVI Panzer Corps, all objectives abandoned. Units withdrawing under enemy fire. General von Luttwitz, watching his 3 divisions being systematically destroyed, made the decision that would effectively end Hitler's Ardennes offensive. He ordered a general withdrawal to defensive positions east of the Aar the river. It was the first time during the entire Battle of the Bulge that a German corps commander had explicitly disobeyed Hitler's orders to continue attacking regardless of casualties. Luttwitz's withdrawal order triggered a cascade of similar decisions across the German front. Other German commanders, seeing Luttwitz's formations retreating in chaos, recognized that continued offensive operations were tactically impossible. By noon on December 26, the German offensive had effectively ended. Not because German forces lacked the will to continue fighting, not because of American ground resistance or Allied air power, but because proximity fuse artillery had made coordinated German attacks impossibly costly. The numbers told the story. During the 43-minute barrage in the Aar the River Valley, German forces suffered approximately 4,200 casualties, more than during any comparable period of the entire war. Of the 300 German tanks and assault guns that began the attack, fewer than 80 remained operational by the end of the day. But perhaps more importantly, German commanders finally began to understand what they were facing. Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, captured the German realization in his after-action report: the Americans possess artillery shells that detonate automatically at optimal height above targets. This technology makes traditional infantry and armor tactics suicidal. Recommend immediate tactical doctrine revision and development of countermeasures. German intelligence officers, analyzing shell fragments recovered from the battlefield, found small electronic components unlike anything in German weapons technology. The fragments suggested some form of radio or radar device, but German scientists couldn't determine how such complex electronics could function inside an artillery shell. The proximity fuse remained a mystery to German forces, but its tactical implications were now undeniable. American artillery had achieved a quantum leap in effectiveness that rendered German offensive operations impossible. Field Marshal Model, receiving reports from across his front, faced the collapse of Hitler's last strategic gamble. The Ardennes offensive had been stopped not by superior American numbers or tactics, but by a technological revolution that had turned artillery from an area weapon into a precision killing system. If you believe these World War II technological stories should never be forgotten, subscribing is the best way to make sure they aren't buried by YouTube's algorithm. On the evening of December 26, Model sent a coded message to Hitler's headquarters that effectively announced the end of the Ardennes offensive: continued attacks impossible due to enemy artillery superiority. Recommend immediate transition to defensive operations to preserve remaining forces. Hitler's response was predictable: continue attacking regardless of casualties. But it no longer mattered what Hitler ordered. German field commanders had seen proximity fuses turn their formations into killing fields, and most were now refusing direct orders to continue offensive operations. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany's last strategic reserve had been sacrificed to a secret American weapon that German forces still didn't understand. The immediate aftermath of the proximity fuse revelation rippled through German command structures like a shockwave of technological terror and tactical confusion. By December 27, 1944, German field commanders across the Ardennes front were filing reports that read more like science fiction than military analysis. Colonel Hans von Luck, 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment: American artillery shells appear to contain automatic detonation devices. Shells explode at precise optimal height without visible time fuse adjustment by enemy gunners. Recommend immediate investigation by technical specialists. Major Friedrich von der Heydt, 6th Parachute Regiment, enemy indirect fire effectiveness increased beyond all previous parameters. Standard defensive procedures ineffective against shells that detonate above ground level automatically. General Otto von Manschufel, 5th Panzer Army, American artillery capabilities have fundamentally changed. Traditional tactical doctrine requires complete revision to address new enemy weapon systems. These reports created chaos at German Army Group B headquarters. Field Marshal Walter Model found himself facing not just tactical defeat, but technological obsolescence that threatened the basic principles of German military doctrine. Model's intelligence chief, Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, attempted to make sense of the contradictory battlefield reports. German forces described American shells that thought for themselves and knew exactly when to explode. Captured shell fragments contained mysterious electronic components that German technical experts couldn't identify. The Americans have developed some form of automatic fuse mechanism, Gehlen reported to Model on December 28. Our technical analysis suggests radio or radar principles, but we cannot determine how such complex electronics function under the stress of artillery firing. This technology represents a fundamental advancement in indirect fire weapons. More troubling for German commanders was the tactical implication: if American forces possessed shells that automatically detonated at optimal height, then traditional German defensive doctrine was also compromised. German troops in foxholes, behind earthworks, even in shallow bunkers would be vulnerable to fragments raining down from above. The psychological effect on German soldiers was equally devastating. Veterans who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts found themselves facing a weapon that seemed to violate the basic rules of warfare they understood. Sergeant Klaus Richter, 276th Volksgrenadier Division, wrote in his diary, "The American shells explode above us like the wrath of God. There is nowhere to hide, no technique that provides protection. We are fighting ghosts who can see through the earth itself." German medical units reported unprecedented psychological casualties. Soldiers who had endured conventional artillery bombardments without breaking were suffering complete nervous collapse after exposure to proximity fuse attacks. The predictable rhythm of traditional artillery, the whistle of incoming shells, the ground impact, the explosion, had been replaced by invisible death falling from the sky without warning. But perhaps most devastating was the realization among German commanders that they had no technological response available. German weapons development had focused on rockets, jet aircraft, and advanced tank designs. No German research program had anticipated the proximity fuse concept, and no German industrial capacity existed for rapid development of countermeasures. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, German Army Chief of Staff, received Model's detailed reports on December 30 and immediately grasped the strategic implications. In a memorandum to Hitler's headquarters, Guderian wrote, "American artillery technology has achieved decisive superiority over German capabilities. Continued offensive operations will result in disproportionate casualties without corresponding tactical gains. Recommend immediate defensive posture to preserve remaining forces while counter-technologies are developed." Hitler's response was characteristically furious and unrealistic. The Führer ordered continued attacks and demanded that German scientists immediately develop equivalent weapons. But German research facilities were being bombed daily, raw materials were scarce, and no German scientist had even conceived of radio-controlled artillery fuses. Meanwhile, American commanders were discovering the full tactical potential of their secret weapon. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, received detailed after-action reports describing proximity fuse effectiveness and immediately authorized expanded use. By January 1, 1945, every American artillery unit in Europe was equipped with unlimited proximity fuse ammunition. "The proximity fuse has revolutionized indirect fire support," Bradley noted in his daily report to Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower. "German casualties from our artillery have increased by an estimated 600%. Enemy offensive capabilities have been effectively neutralized." But Bradley also recognized the strategic implications beyond the immediate battle. If proximity fuses could devastate German ground forces so effectively, they could also be adapted for use against German V-1 flying bombs and potentially against mass German aircraft formations. American technical teams were already working on proximity fuse variants optimized for anti-aircraft use. The same radio principles that made artillery shells detonate at optimal height above ground targets could be adapted to detonate at optimal proximity to aircraft. The technological revolution was just beginning. German forces, meanwhile, were adapting their tactics in desperate attempts to counter the new American capability. Infantry units began advancing only at night, in small dispersed groups, avoiding any formation that might present a concentrated target for proximity fuse artillery. German armor commanders adopted new movement techniques. Tanks advanced individually, using maximum terrain cover, avoiding any coordination that might create profitable targets for American gunners. But these tactical adaptations came at enormous cost in coordination and effectiveness. German forces that had previously advanced in coordinated formations were now reduced to infiltration tactics that severely limited their offensive potential. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, whose armored spearhead had been devastated by the first proximity fuse barrage, attempted to describe the tactical challenge in his final combat report. The Americans possess artillery shells that automatically explode at the height that will cause maximum casualties to our forces. This makes coordinated attacks impossible during daylight hours. Small unit infiltration tactics provide some protection, but eliminate the concentrated firepower necessary for breakthrough operations. German commanders faced an impossible tactical equation. Formations large enough to achieve breakthrough were also large enough to be devastated by proximity fuse artillery. Formations small enough to survive proximity fuse attacks were too small to achieve tactical objectives. By early January 1945, German forces in the Ardennes had effectively abandoned offensive operations entirely. The Battle of the Bulge had become a fighting withdrawal as German units attempted to retreat to defensive positions while minimizing exposure to American proximity fuse artillery. The technological surprise was complete. German forces had been introduced to America's most secret weapon in the most brutal way possible, through the systematic destruction of their last strategic offensive capability. Stories like these take months of archive research and veteran interviews. If you want more untold World War II technology revelations, subscribing literally keeps this content alive. Hitler's final gamble had been crushed not by superior American strategy or overwhelming Allied numbers, but by a secret weapon that German forces still barely understood and had no ability to counter. The proximity fuse had turned the Battle of the Bulge from Germany's last hope into Germany's technological defeat. The proximity fuse's debut during the Battle of the Bulge created ripple effects that extended far beyond the snow-covered fields of Belgium. This single technological revelation fundamentally altered not just the immediate course of World War II, but the entire trajectory of modern warfare. Within weeks of the Ardennes fighting, proximity fuses were being adapted for multiple roles across all theaters of the war. American forces in the Pacific began using them against Japanese banzai charges, turning suicidal infantry attacks into mechanical slaughter. Allied forces in Italy discovered that proximity fuses were devastatingly effective against German mountain positions that had previously been nearly impossible to attack with conventional artillery. But the most revolutionary application came in February 1945, when proximity fuse shells were first used against German V-1 flying bombs approaching London. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required gunners to estimate the speed, altitude, and trajectory of incoming aircraft, then set time fuses to explode shells at the calculated interception point. Against fast-moving targets like V-1 rockets, this was nearly impossible. Most anti-aircraft shells exploded harmlessly in empty sky. Proximity fuses solved this problem instantly. Anti-aircraft shells equipped with radio fuses would automatically detonate when they detected nearby aircraft, creating a lethal cloud of fragments that could destroy incoming missiles without requiring perfect timing or accuracy from gunners. The results were dramatic. German V-1 attacks against London, which had terrorized civilians for months, were suddenly being intercepted at rates exceeding 90%. Britain's anti-aircraft defenses had been transformed from largely ineffective last resorts into precision killing systems. German weapons engineers, analyzing fragments from proximity fuse shells that had failed to explode, finally began to understand what they faced. Dr. Herbert Wagner, Germany's leading guided weapons specialist, submitted a technical report to the Reich Ministry of Armaments in March 1945. American proximity fuses represent a fundamental breakthrough in weapons technology. The miniaturization of radio components into artillery shells suggests manufacturing capabilities far beyond current German industrial capacity. Development of equivalent systems would require complete restructuring of our electronics industry. But by March 1945, Germany's electronics industry was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Even if German scientists had possessed the theoretical knowledge to develop proximity fuse technology, they lacked the manufacturing capability to produce complex miniaturized electronics in wartime conditions. The technological gap was becoming a strategic chasm. American proximity fuse production, meanwhile, was reaching industrial scale. By April 1945, American factories were producing over 200,000 proximity fuses per day. These weren't just artillery shells. Proximity fuses were being incorporated into anti-aircraft ammunition, naval gunfire, even experimental surface-to-air missiles. The proximity fuse concept was spawning an entire family of smart weapons. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was psychological and doctrinal. German military commanders who survived the war consistently identified proximity fuses as the moment they realized Germany had lost technological superiority to the Allies. General Heinz Guderian, in his post-war memoirs, wrote, "The proximity fuse represented more than a new weapon, it demonstrated that American industrial and technological capabilities had surpassed German innovation. When artillery shells began thinking for themselves, we knew the war was lost." This realization extended beyond immediate military applications. German scientists and engineers recognized that proximity fuses represented a breakthrough in miniaturized electronics that could revolutionize civilian technology as well as military systems. Dr. Wernher von Braun, Germany's rocket development chief, later recalled, "American proximity fuses revealed capabilities in electronic miniaturization that we had not considered possible." The implications extended far beyond artillery. If electronics could be made small enough and robust enough to function inside artillery shells, they could be incorporated into rockets, aircraft, even civilian communication systems. The proximity fuse had inadvertently provided a preview of the electronic revolution that would transform the post-war world. American military leaders, meanwhile, were already planning the next generation of proximity fuse applications. Research teams were developing proximity fuses for use in strategic bombing, naval warfare, even potential nuclear weapons delivery systems. The Manhattan Project's technical team had noted that proximity fuses could be adapted to detonate nuclear weapons at optimal altitude for maximum blast effects. The same technology that had revolutionized conventional artillery could potentially maximize the destructive power of atomic bombs. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, proximity fuses had been used in over 500,000 artillery shells and anti-aircraft rounds. German forces never developed effective countermeasures. The technological surprise that had begun during the Battle of the Bulge remained decisive until Germany's final surrender. But proximity fuses continued to influence warfare long after 1945. The basic concept, weapons that automatically adjust their function based on proximity to targets, became fundamental to modern military technology. From guided missiles to smart bombs to automated defense systems, proximity sensing technology spawned generations of increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. The Cold War arms race, the development of surface-to-air missiles, even modern drone warfare can trace technological lineage back to those first proximity fuse shells that exploded above German formations in the Belgian snow. Every one of these technological revelations takes months of declassified document research. Subscribing helps fund the archive access and veteran interviews that make these stories possible. The proximity fuse had done more than help win World War II, it had launched the age of smart weapons that would define modern warfare for decades to come. And it had all begun with German soldiers staring up at artillery shells that seemed to think for themselves. Heinrich Krüger, the German panzergrenadier who witnessed proximity fuses annihilate his entire company on December 23, 1944, survived the war and returned to his home in Bavaria in late 1945. For the rest of his life, Kruger would wake up in cold sweats, reliving those 30 seconds when the sky opened up and rained death on his comrades. Not because of the casualties, he had seen men die before, but because of the implications. "We were fighting ghosts," Kruger told his son decades later. Artillery shells that thought for themselves. Weapons that could see through the earth and know exactly when to explode. It was not warfare as we understood it, it was something from the future. Kruger had witnessed more than a technological surprise. He had seen the moment when warfare itself evolved beyond human comprehension. The proximity fuse represented something unprecedented in military history, a weapon that could think. Not think like humans think, but process information, make decisions, and execute actions autonomously. The same shell that destroyed Kruger's company didn't need a human operator to determine when to explode. It sensed its environment and acted accordingly. In 30 seconds of mechanical slaughter in the Belgian snow, proximity fuses had provided a preview of autonomous warfare that wouldn't fully emerge for another 70 years. Today, as military forces worldwide deploy increasingly sophisticated autonomous weapon systems, drones that select their own targets, missiles that navigate without human guidance, defensive systems that engage threats automatically, the technological lineage traces back to those first proximity fuse shells that exploded above German formations in December 1944. Heinrich Kruger, unknowingly, had witnessed the birth of smart weapons. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last gamble to change the course of World War II. Instead, it became the debut of technology that would change the nature of warfare itself. German soldiers went to their graves never fully understanding what had killed so many of their comrades. They knew only that American artillery shells had learned to think. And in learning to think, weapons had taken the first step toward making human soldiers obsolete. The proximity fuse remained classified for decades after World War II ended. Only in the 1970s did military historians gain access to documents revealing the full scope of this technological revolution. By then, proximity sensing had evolved into guidance systems for missiles, automated targeting for defensive weapons, even the electronic fuses in modern smart bombs. The technology that first appeared above German formations in 1944 had spawned an entire family of autonomous weapon systems. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of proximity fuses is their preview of warfare's future. Today, as military forces deploy increasingly sophisticated autonomous weapons, drones that kill without human operators, defensive systems that engage threats automatically, artificial intelligence that selects targets independently, we're seeing the fulfillment of technology that began with radio fuses in artillery shells. Heinrich Kruger and his fellow German soldiers were among the first human beings to face weapons that could think for themselves. They wouldn't be the last. The Battle of the Bulge ended Hitler's final offensive. But more importantly, it began the age of smart weapons that continues to revolutionize warfare today. Some technological surprises change individual battles. Others change the nature of war itself. The proximity fuse did both.